They thought he was just some tired old man in a windbreaker, harmless, quiet, maybe a little confused. The kind that clutches his armrest during takeoff and asked for warm water instead of coffee. He sat alone in seat 17C, staring out the window like he didn't quite belong in the world anymore. The flight attendant barely smiled as she walked past him, muttering under her breath to the other crew, "Poor guy, probably thinks this is still a propeller plane." He didn't correct her. He just shifted slightly in his seat, eyes flickering to the cockpit door. He didn't know why not yet, but something in his bones told him this flight would not end the way it was supposed to. 2 hours later, after the pilot's voice faltered mid-sentence and silence fell over the intercom, they would remember that man in 17C. After the emergency landing, after the news crews came and went, and after passengers stood crying on the tarmac, someone finally opened the small black carry-on he'd left behind, the one no one had paid attention to. Inside, a flight logbook with classified flight codes dating back to 1988, 3 medals no one on board had ever seen before, and a faded letter tucked inside the front pocket. It was from a general. Handwritten. It read, "To Captain Samuel Dawes. Thank you for the 42 lives you saved over hostile airspace. You didn't just fly the mission. You flew hope into darkness. Now, before we take you into the cockpit of this story, into the seconds that nearly tore apart 217 lives at 30,000 feet, let us ask you, have you ever seen someone dismissed, overlooked, and doubted, only to become the very reason everything survived? If you believe real heroes still walk quietly among us, unnoticed until the moment they're most needed, hit like, hit subscribe, and stay with us. Because this story doesn't just honor a veteran. It reveals what true leadership looks like when the world isn't watching. The flight from Phoenix to Seattle was supposed to be routine, just under 3 hours, calm weather, no turbulence expected. The seatbelt sign had just switched off when a businessman in first class began recording out the window for his travel vlog. Kids scrolled on tablets. Flight attendants poured ginger ale into plastic cups. No one, not one person, knew the pilot had already gone pale behind the locked door, clutching his chest, slumped against the throttle. Somewhere over the Colorado peaks, the aircraft lurched to the left. At first, people thought it was turbulence, but the movement was wrong, jagged, uncorrected. The second officer's voice crackled over the PA system, uncertain, tight with panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is anyone on board with aviation experience, please alert a crew member immediately." Silence. Gasps. Then murmurs. A woman shouted, "What's happening?" Another screamed, "Is there no backup pilot?" In the back, in seat 17C, Samuel Dawes slowly unbuckled his belt. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a decade of arthritis and too many winters alone in Spokane. The man in the next seat looked over. "You okay, old-timer?" he asked, half snickering. Dawes nodded. "I just need to speak to the crew." As he stood, a nearby teenager whispered, "Grandpa's about to have a stroke," and a young flight attendant rushed forward. "Sir, please stay seated." But he was already moving. There was something in his walk, measured, unwavering, that stopped her cold. "I was a pilot," he said softly. "Military. Long time ago." "Sir," she said, hesitating. "I've flown this model before," he added. That was when the voice from the cockpit came again, this time more strained. "We're attempting manual control. I may need assistance." And just like that, the crew parted. Passengers stared as the old man in the windbreaker walked toward the front. Some rolled their eyes. A few snickered. One man muttered, "This is how we die." But then Dawes reached the cockpit, placed a weathered hand on the door, and said something only the co-pilot could hear. Whatever it was, it changed everything. The door opened. And for the next 27 minutes, no one spoke. No one laughed. And when the plane finally touched down, safely, smoothly, on a secondary runway in Salt Lake City, applause didn't erupt right away. People sat frozen, in awe, because they knew that man in 17C hadn't come to fly again. He had come to save lives. Quietly, without asking for permission. And when he exited the plane without a word, someone finally asked his name. All he said was, "Samuel." "That'll do." But the airline manifest would say Captain Samuel Dawes, retired, USAF. And seat 17C would never be just another seat again. They still didn't believe it. Some of them, anyway. Even after he stepped into the cockpit and the door sealed behind him, whispers rose like static in the cabin, disjointed murmurs of fear and disbelief. "Who even is that guy?" one woman hissed. "They're letting some random retiree fly the plane," muttered a man in a business suit. sweating through his collar. Another just clutched his armrest, lips moving wordlessly in prayer. The crew tried to maintain order, moving up and down the aisle with uneasy urgency, but the tension was thick enough that every announcement over the intercom crackled like a verdict. For nearly a minute, there was only silence. Then a new voice came over the speakers. Not panicked, not polished, just calm and steady in a way that made the plane go completely still. "This is Captain Samuel Dawes. I flew this model before it was civilian certified. We've stabilized altitude, and I'll be coordinating with ground control now. We'll get you home." Just like that, it shifted everything. Fear didn't vanish, but it bent, softened under the weight of something older than faith. Confidence. He didn't sound like a man pretending to be in charge. He sounded like a man who had already done this, maybe not in years, maybe not in uniform, but in muscle memory and in his bones. And inside that cockpit, Samuel was steadying hands that hadn't touched a flight stick in almost 2 decades. The co-pilot, barely 30 and clearly shaking, gave him a look that was equal parts hope and desperation. "Sir, we lost the primary NAV lock when the captain slumped." He hit the panel. Dawes nodded. "Trims off by 3 degrees. Manual it. I'll fix the heading." He moved slowly, fingers gliding across controls with the kind of reverence you give only to something that once saved your life. The cockpit wasn't quite the same, but the bones were familiar. The sound of airflow, the soft vibration of a humming engine, the buzz of secondary comms crackling faintly. For the first time since boarding, Dawes' hands didn't shake. He knew what he was doing here. The jet began to level out. In the cabin, passengers glanced at one another. No sharp turns, no lurches, no sudden drops. Just smooth, clean air. It wasn't over. Not yet. But something had shifted. In seat 11D, a little boy who had been crying softly now looked out the window, lips parted in quiet awe. He gripped a plastic model jet in his small fist and whispered to his mother, "Is the old man a real pilot?" His mother didn't answer. She didn't know. But the flight attendant standing nearby, she whispered, "Yes. Yes, he is." Back in the cockpit, Dawes toggled the secondary navigation system and pulled up Salt Lake City's emergency approach frequency. The co-pilot stammered, "Should we declare a mayday?" Dawes glanced at him. "Already did. Before I sat down." The co-pilot blinked. "You did." Dawes gave the faintest smile. Old habit. And that was the thing. This wasn't panic piloting. This was muscle, honed over decades, buried beneath the dust of civilian life, but never forgotten. He checked crosswinds, calculated descent rates by hand, and adjusted the flaps manually with a precision that came not from training, but from surviving what training never prepared you for. War zones, night ops, bleeding sky. He never told the co-pilot that. He didn't need to. The man beside him could already feel it. Every time Samuel reached for a control, he moved like someone who understood that lives weren't just numbers. They were names. They were mothers, sons, strangers who trusted the sky to stay still. And now the sky was his again. Salt Lake City ATC. This is Delta Flight 1487. Veteran pilot Samuel Dawes at comms, requesting emergency clearance. Captain incapacitated, co-pilot stable, crew on board. 217 souls. We are at FL 320. Descending now to FL 280 per your instruction. Over. A moment of static. Then a voice came back. "Captain Dawes, sir, welcome back. You are cleared for runway 3R, vector 215. We've got your eyes on approach. You've got this." Dawes didn't answer with words. He just tapped the yoke once with his fingertips, then leaned in slightly and began the slow, methodical process of descent. In the cabin, people noticed. Noticed how the turbulence had stopped. Noticed how the plane began to move with intention. They didn't know what was happening in the cockpit, but they felt it. They felt the shift from chaos to command. And slowly, almost guiltily, those same passengers who'd scoffed began to murmur other things. "He saved us. How did he even know what to do? Is he some kind of hero?" No one had an answer. But every eye turned forward. Toward the cockpit. Toward the sealed door. Toward the man they'd dismissed without a thought. Somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry softly, not out of fear, but relief. The fear was fading, and it was being replaced with something else. Gratitude. Reverence. The understanding that not all heroes walk in with uniforms and medals. Some just sit and coach, in silence, until the moment their purpose returns. 30 miles out, Dawes tapped the intercom again. We'll be touching down shortly. Please remain calm and seated. Flight attendants, prep for landing. And thank you for your trust. And even though they couldn't see him, nearly everyone on that plane nodded. Because somehow, they knew he hadn't flown them to safety yet. But he would. It was the kind of landing that pilots train for but rarely face. Manual descent, secondary systems only, wind pushing hard against the right side, runway lights flickering ahead like distant salvation. And through all of it, Captain Samuel Dawes sat composed, one hand resting lightly on the yoke, the other steady on the throttle, his breathing calm, his mind utterly still. The co-pilot had gone silent now, not from fear but from awe, watching a man who had flown combat missions in a different century make judgment calls faster than the instruments could blink. As the nose aligned with runway 3R and the wheels kissed the tarmac with a long, controlled screech, the passengers erupted, not in wild applause, but in a stunned, breathless silence broken only by one woman whispering, "We're on the ground." Dawes brought the jet to a slow, graceful stop at the far end of the airstrip, engines whirring down like exhaling lungs, and only then, only after everything was safe, did he unclasp his hands from the controls. "Welcome home," he murmured to no one in particular. The emergency crews were already there, floodlights cutting through the twilight as medics boarded swiftly, removing the unconscious captain from the cockpit, while ATC radioed the terminal, "Runway clear." Aircraft recovered. Incident stabilized thanks to civilian veteran pilot. Not passenger. Not unidentified male. Just veteran. Outside the aircraft, passengers were led down staircases onto the tarmac. Some wept. Others held each other. But they all turned back to look toward the open cockpit door. Samuel Dawes emerged last, moving slowly, the windbreaker still zipped tight against his chest. He wore no badge. No ribbons. But people parted for him like water around stone. One by one, they nodded, eyes full of questions they couldn't ask, reverence they couldn't explain. Someone reached out to shake his hand. He accepted, briefly, but then kept walking toward the terminal, where the press hadn't yet arrived and no cameras had been raised. He didn't want the spotlight. He never had. But that didn't stop it from finding him. Near the security checkpoint, an airline official approached in a flurry. "Sir, the FAA wants to speak with you, and corporate's asking if you—" Dawes raised one hand softly. Later, then he turned to go, but was stopped by the sound of boots. Dress boots, sharp and rhythmic against polished tile. A young man in full Air Force blues stepped forward, saluted sharply. "Captain Dawes?" he asked. Dawes raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Sir, my name is Lieutenant Marcus Lang. I was named after your old wing commander. My father served under you during Operation Hammerlight. When the incident report came through, he called me and said, 'If Samuel Dawes just landed a Delta flight, tell him I said, thank you for teaching us all how to stay calm when the sky falls.'" For a moment, Dawes didn't speak. Then he extended his hand, not with stiffness, but with quiet pride. "Tell your father he taught me plenty, too." And then, unexpectedly, Lang reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded page, a printed copy of a scanned letter. Dawes recognized it immediately. The letter, the one he'd written and tucked into his flight logbook decades ago after his final mission. He had never mailed it, had never shown it to anyone. Yet here it was, passed on, remembered. "How?" he whispered. Lang smiled. "There's a group of us. Pilots. Children of your squadron. We've kept the records. The stories. We meet every year on the anniversary. That letter? It's our pledge." Dawes' voice barely held. "I thought they were all gone." Lang nodded. "You're the last. But not forgotten." Behind them, the passengers were still watching, silent now, reverent, humbled in a way that no turbulence could cause. One young girl with a plastic jet clutched to her chest waved at him timidly. Dawes smiled, just slightly, and tipped an imaginary cap. He didn't need to be recognized. He needed people to understand. As he turned to leave the airport, a small crowd of airline staff and flight crew gathered to one side. The same flight attendant who had stopped him at the start now stepped forward with reddened eyes. "We were wrong," she said, barely above a whisper. "About you." Dawes paused. "It's not about being right," he said gently. "It's about doing what's needed when the time comes." Then he reached into his carry-on and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with coordinates, altitudes, and stories that had never made the papers. He handed it to her. Make sure your pilots read this. Not because it's mine, but because some lessons don't come from manuals. She took it with both hands like it was something sacred. Thank you, she whispered. And that was enough. No ceremony. No medal. Just understanding. That night, the news ran a quiet segment. Retired Air Force veteran lands passenger jet after captain collapse. Lives saved. But it wasn't the headline that mattered. It was the ripple. At airfields. In mess halls. Among young recruits. The name Dawes was spoken again. And in classrooms where future pilots trained, instructors began the lesson not with slides, but with a question: who here remembers the man in 17C? And slowly, hands began to rise. Because legacy doesn't always arrive on wings. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting, until the moment the sky calls again.